Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session of Commonwealth North's Fiscal Policy Study Group. My name is Juanetta Ayers. I'm the Executive Director for Commonwealth North. And we will start today with our co-chair, Cheryl Frasca, for some opening remarks, and then we'll welcome our speaker today. So Cheryl, go ahead.
Thank you, Juanetta, and thank you all for joining us this morning. For Representative Carpenter, we're a fiscal policy study group, as Juanetta explained, and we talk about what other people really ought to do in order to address the state's fiscal challenge. And I think sometimes we're on repeat, but with time, just the numbers change a little bit, but the challenge still remains. And so we really appreciate your taking on the role of the Ways and Means Committee and reestablishing that, and also for taking time this morning to talk with us. And over the years, most of the folks who are on this call today have been getting together sometimes once a week for months on end to talk about options and scenarios. So we appreciate your elevating the discussion amongst your peers and amongst Alaskans. So with that, thank you again for joining us this morning. We know your time is precious, and I'll turn it over to Juanetta for the logistics of how we'll proceed forward. So again, thank you.
Okay, and Representative Carpenter, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself, I will spotlight you, and you are a co-host, so you can share screen as well if you choose to, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Yes. All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation with you today. Look forward to any questions that you might have. I'm going to present just kind of where we're at and where we came from and where we're at. Getting right to it, I picked up the chair of Ways and Means this year. Right off the bat, I decided to use the Fiscal Policy Working Group report that was generated in 2021 as a starting point for a conversation about some sort of fiscal solution for us. And the reason I did that is because it had bipartisan and bicameral support in the building. It wasn't unanimous support, but we had enough there to start having a conversation. And so that's what I use as the foundation. Let me see if I can get the screen shared here, and I'll show you kind of where Ways and Means sits right now. And I hope I'm doing this right. I don't normally share my slide or share my screen. Okay, so you can see.
Yeah, we see your slide. Go ahead.
There's probably a way to make this bigger, but let's just leave it right there if you can see it. So I basically took the recommendations from the Fiscal Policy Working Group and created a couple focus areas in Ways and Means. What didn't come out of the Fiscal Policy Working Group in 2021 was any specific recommendations, no resolutions, no bills, nothing that the legislature could take action on, just some recommendations of areas to focus on. So what Ways and Means has been able to do is actually put some bills and resolutions together to address the kind of the focus areas. So this is what we've got sitting before us right now that I think is kind of choices amongst a fiscal plan. You can see that I've highlighted the kind of the nexus of a plan to focus on settling the PFD problem that we have, accountability and efficient spending as a important thing for state government, and revenue generation as part of the solution. Economic growth I've added in. That wasn't necessarily a recommendation coming out of the Fiscal Policy Working Group, but I think we all recognize that we've got to have a growing economy in the state if we want to stem the outward migration of folks and have jobs for our kids. So we've got 6 different bills and resolutions that address the PFD problem. We've got two bills and a resolution and a House bill resolution and a bill dealing with a spending limit. You've got some bills that were introduced by the governor that's corporate tax, carbon policy related. And those are really tied to what's going on with a LNG pipeline. There's some nexus there that's really important. And I don't know whether we get into that conversation today, but there is some relation there. And then I introduced a corporate income tax reduction measure that is intended to help provide opportunity for businesses to come into the state and invest in our state, to invest in the opportunities that entrepreneurs see. And then the revenue generation measure has got a sales tax. Now, I understand that there might be other members of the committee that want to introduce a different type of revenue generation measure. As I look at the calendar, we got about 6 weeks left in this session. So really, we're kind of running out of time to have conversations about alternatives. But what I felt was doable for my own caucus. Not everybody is in favor of sales tax. I certainly am not interested in a sales tax if it doesn't include other measures within a fiscal plan. But just kind of sensing the room, if you will, within the legislature, I think that there's a way forward with a broad-based sales tax as opposed to any other broad-based measure. So that's kind of where we're at. And the reason that we're continuing to focus on this is because we've got this structural problem that we have, that your three sources of revenue mainly are your oil tax, your oil revenue coming with royalties into oil, and your federal dollars that are coming into the state, and your permanent fund earnings. That's basically the three-legged stool that we've been aware of, and that's basically what it is that we fight over every year, how we're going to spend that money. There's a small other that I like to talk about that if I put it into one of the three categories, I put it in with the oil taxes, and that is your corporate income tax, your other fees and things like that are coming from your non-oil economy. That's a really small portion of the budget, but that's where most of Alaskans live and work, in that non-oil economy. So if we're talking about what is needed for the future is economic growth in that non-oil economy. I'm not wanting to say that we don't need to grow our oil industry, because I'm in favor of economic growth in the oil industry. But I think solving the problem within the state budget problem, is having economic growth in that non-oil. And that's basically, if it's a small function of the state right now, or it's a small thing that we deal with on a budget conversation, that's where the greatest opportunity is. If you've got a real giant oil revenue that comes and goes because it fluctuates, that's not really where the opportunity lies. The opportunity lies where we don't have a lot of economic activity, but there could be if we established policy that incentivizes growth in those areas. So that's kind of what I'm thinking is this starting conversation with a structural problem, is to help us break our dependence on that three sources of revenue. And if you really think that the government lobby down here is heavily invested in spending those largely three sources of revenue on government programs, our institution of government, both at the state level and at lower jurisdictions, our nonprofits within the state, and then those businesses that capitalize on state and federal dollars as part of their business plan, that's kind of the lobby that exists down here. And on an annual basis, the lobby that we see down here just focuses on those three sources of revenue and spending them how we always spend them. And it's a cyclical nature that's it has to be broken. So how do you generate activity or interest from the portion of the economy that you want to grow? That's the kind of the problem that we have. We're never going to be able to get away with it, away from, or eliminate the government lobby. It's always going to be with us. But what we do need to have down here as part of the conversation to balance the conversation in favor of economic growth is a more effective private sector lobby. It's difficult because we're not on the road network, but we should be thinking of the private sector lobby, the economic engine lobby, a cost of doing business is showing up in Juneau to share your feelings. This is why I think that a sales tax is really, really important. Human nature being what it is, we're much more inclined to get motivated when somebody is taking money out of our pocket as opposed to taking money that we're supposed to get, but we don't actually have yet. And I'm drawing a comparison between the permanent fund dividend and sales tax. So money coming into us from a permanent fund dividend that gets cut through the appropriations process doesn't have the same emotional impact to me as a sales tax does, or an income tax does, that takes money out of my pocket, just speaking at it specifically from a human nature perspective. So what I believe is that when we restructure our government to restructure our tax structure to reduce the corporate income tax down to a low level that enables and incentivizes economic activity from those institutions or entities that have money to spend on ideas within the state, and restructure it so that a broad-based sales tax is collecting a little bit from everyone, right? The intent of the sales tax is to be as broad as possible and as small as possible. The projection is that we can get $900 million out of a 2% sales tax. But if you include that in the package, a reduction of your corporate income tax rate, then you're going to need to generate or account for that about $400 million loss in revenue. So your 900 million on a sales tax really drops down to 700 million. And wouldn't you know it, the budget deficit that we have this year with basically a 50-50 split of the dividend is about 400 million. Well, we're still having conversations in the budget cycle about what we want to do with BSA increases and defined benefits and all of this other government lobby spend pressure. And we can save the debate for another day as to the positives and negatives about those arguments or which direction we should go. But the reality is we don't have the economic engine to support everything that we want. And the focus has got to be on growing our economy. We are, I think, I don't presume to know what you guys have talked about in your organization over the last little bit, but as I look at what's happening with our three sources of revenue, I say that the next few years are not looking good for us. Oil revenue is likely to be down. The price of oil is likely to have a downwards pressure on the price. Our national debt and the conversation that's happening in our national scene is likely to have a downwards pressure on the number of federal dollars that are flowing out of the government, out of the Fed into the states. And we're a net positive recipient of federal dollars. So it's likely that we're going to see, if not in a couple of years, within this decade, a decrease in the amount of federal dollars that are flowing into the state. And if the federal policy changes where we're reducing spending at the federal level, that's going to have a direct impact on our stock market and investments. So it is plausible that we're going to see a downturn in our investment earnings as well. Now, to bolster that argument, we're now in the second year of a downturn on our permanent fund earnings, because we've got a 5-year look back for determining the amount that we can spend out of the permanent fund. Next year is really a pivotal year. If we have another downturn investment wise and coupled with high inflation, we're looking at having a reduced amount of revenue out of a 5% market value draw coming from the permanent fund for state government. So you've got a trifecta of decreases coming with the sources of revenue that we have. And largely all three of those are outside of our Alaskan influence to make policy changes that are going to increase the revenue. So it is critical that we put in place some policy changes that incentivize economic growth, especially in our non-oil economy. There's a lot that goes into that. I'm not expecting government to grow our economy. That's not what government's purpose is from my perspective. I like the Ronald Reagan way of thinking about this, that government just needs to get out of the way and let people who know how to create wealth. And that's really what we need in this state, is wealth creators to get busy creating wealth, creating jobs, making life easier for us. When we have a growing economy, all of the other issues that we fight over in the legislature become easier because we have a new flow of money coming in. But that is only true if we've got a broad-based tax structure that captures some of that. So to the extent that a corporate income tax reduction incentivizes economic activity, to the extent that a broad-based tax doesn't hurt our growth of an economic activity, we're restructuring it so that the future, the next 10 years looks good. Now, economic growth isn't going to be just tied to sales tax or corporate income tax reductions. There are other issues at play that would lead to reducing barriers for economic growth. One of those is energy, right? Well, low-cost energy is necessary for South Central and interior Alaska, especially for any kind of economic growth that's going to happen. My understanding is that we're moving forward with a LNG pipeline from the North Slope with offtakes in both the interior and South Central Alaska. We're 5 to 7 years out from that even being a reality. So within this decade, we could likely have lower cost energy. If you couple that with some tax policy change that is incentivizing activity, then by the time we get this all our ducks in a row and low cost energy showing up somewhere 5-7 years from now, we could really be looking at some opportunity to grow in the state of Alaska. If you pause with that conversation and say, if the alternative is continuing what we've been doing, which is fighting over the PFD, then we're not likely to be able to capitalize. We're not going to be in a position to be able to capitalize on the activity that could happen when that low cost energy shows up. And I know that there's probably folks that have varying opinions on whether that pipeline's ever going to be a reality. We've been talking about it for long enough, but I'm encouraged by the fact that Goldman Sachs is on board with AGDC in my terms, corralling the investors for this project. That's a positive sign that people at certain levels have made decisions that this plan or this project has legs and can move forward. We've got some decisions to make in the state government as to what that looks like for the state of Alaska coming in the next 12 months, 12 to 24 months sometime. But anyway, I think that the future looks bright when you look at it in context of policy change, especially centered around tax and economic growth, and a coupling with low cost energy coming in here somewhere in the next 5 to 7 years that we could it would really benefit the state and provide opportunities that we don't have now, and we're not likely to have if we don't deal with the problems that are sitting with us perennially each year. So that's basically in a nutshell where my headspace is and what I'm thinking. I came in a little late to this meeting, and we were just in a House Majority Caucus discussing this very thing. So we don't have everything ironed out yet. We are working as hard as we can to find a way forward that's going to benefit Alaskans economically. Frankly speaking, this year's budget is not nearly as important to me and won't have nearly the impact on our 10-year outlook as a fiscal plan would. And so that's where I'm focusing. It's where I'm trying to influence and have, keep the pressure on doing something this year that betters our situation 10 years from now, because just focusing on the annual budget is not going to do that. So I would like to pause now and just say I'm ready for questions if people have questions, and let's have a dialogue.
Great. Thank you, Representative Carpenter. I'm going to bring Cheryl back to start the Q&A. And just as a reminder to our participants online, you can put your question in chat and I'll relay it for you. Or as long as people are well disciplined this morning and want to turn on your camera, I will call on you once you turn on your camera or raise your hand. We do ask that you get directly to your question, no editorializing. So Cheryl, with that, go ahead.
What? No editorializing? Come on. But thank you, Representative Carpenter, for your focus on the long-term picture, especially regarding revenues. Last year in January, this group, we had a project with the Commonwealth North where we engaged Alaskans in making choices to balance a $1.3 billion deficit that was in discussions in 2021. And so out of those almost 2,300 responses we got from around the state, there was support. 50% of the respondents said they would support a 1% sales tax. We created scenarios, and so they made choices. If you wanted to spend more or spend less, and how much did it impact the whole, and then what revenues would you use to fill it. So there was openness. 2% sales tax had 11%. No sales tax had only 23%. So that meant 77% of the people were willing to consider a sales tax. So if that gives you any insight into at least what people who responded to our survey said. So that was interesting. And I'll send you the report because I think you might find it of interest to give you some sense of what people were thinking 2 years ago. But the fact is the card deck is still very similar. So with that, and many of the people who are on today's call participated in developing the scenarios that we put forward to Alaskans. And to that end, we stand ready to help you. I mean, I don't know if you're going to get all this solved this session, but in case you don't, and there's still issues that are going to be in play over the interim, we as our study group would like to help with engaging Alaskans and talking about the choices and the trade-offs involved with the various scenarios, something similar to what we did 2 years ago, because it's viewed as an educational tool for those that participate in the survey. It's not just taking a temperature reading at a point in time. So I hope you might find it of interest and meaningful. So that was not a question, but an offer of help. So with that, Juanetta, I'll let you move on to others that may have a question, and then I'll circle back later.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. We haven't had any questions come in just yet, but I'll take a volley. Oh, wait a minute. Here's one from Lisa Parker. She's with us online today. Can you address the sales tax impacts to those communities that already have taxes?
Thanks for the question, Lisa. And I guess maybe one of the things, the devil's in the details of any kind of policy change. The tax proposal that's written is as broad as we can make it. It very few exclusions. There's some federal exclusions that are required, and we're excluding like the business transactions or whatnot. And anyway, if I'm speaking to municipalities, I think sales tax proposals in the past have been, kind of heavy-handed in the sense that we're taking away or collecting the sales tax at the local level and then redistributing in some fashion. But this bill is not intended to do anything like that. It just adds a 2% sales tax on top of whatever the municipalities have. They can manage their own sales tax rate however they want to. The state's not determining how you do your sales tax. Now, there is a provision within this, is that I'm proposing to share the state sales tax 50-50 with municipalities and cities. So as our economic engine in the state grows, there's an opportunity for local municipalities to share in that growth. Now, I would put a caveat in there, and then the caveat's in the legislation that it's tied to being able to keep a downward pressure on property tax within the municipalities. So and it also has a kind of an exclusion for those boroughs that have a oil property tax or something like that, who are already sharing with the state revenue structure. So anyway, these are just proposals at this point. We're going to have the discussion in Ways and Means and see what comes out of it. It's got to make it through the Senate, or make it through the House, and then make it through the Senate, and we'll see where it ends up. But in my estimation, if you've got a broad-based sales tax that is potentially sharing some of the revenue with local municipalities, then it's a win-win for both jurisdictions in some circumstances. Maybe it doesn't meet everyone's circumstances, but it's enough that we can get a buy-in across the state to get the fiscal plan through that really incentivizes economic growth.
Okay, I'm going to bring Jennifer Johnston in. Jennifer, you can unmute.
Hi, Representative. So I kind of spent 4 years working on this sales tax. And I'm not sure if you've considered a couple things. One is, it seemed I had better buy-in if I had a seasonal sales tax, or what I was looking at is maybe a 2% summer tax and a 1% winter tax. And I'm not sure if you've looked at that. The other part of it is with mail order, which we do a lot up here. Now I know AML has now come up with some structure for the local governments to receive the taxes from mail order. But that was another part that could sweeten the state's participation, is that the state could be the collective for mail order and then send that on to the municipalities. But the seasonal aspect, have you looked at that? It seems to Alaskans, you could either up it in the summer even more than 2%. I like the idea that you have no exceptions, because I think that's the only way you can do it. But then you have a buying season for Alaskans. Just a thought.
Thank you, Representative. Appreciate it. Good to see your face, hear your voice. It isn't part of the proposal to have a tiered approach, if you will, if that's a word that can be used for seasonality. It's definitely something that could be written in, and we'll see where the body goes with that. The bill does propose to collect sales tax on online sales that are occurring, through an Amazon style purchase, similar to what we're doing now. And I don't know whether AML is fully on board with losing that ability to manage that for the municipalities. But this bill would, if enacted, do that. It would basically take over where AML started. So I'm not necessarily opposed to having a 1% winter tax and 2% summer tax. It just the higher the percentage rate goes in the summertime, the more negative it is on individuals, and maintaining a low rate across the entire year is just kind of a fair way to approach it. If you're putting a 2% corporate income tax rate and a 2% sales tax rate, the political narrative is such that we're equally supporting our government. I don't know that the devil's in the details. I don't know that I'm unopposed, or I don't know that I'm opposed to what you're suggesting, but I would just have to model it and see how it shakes out.
And a follow-up, as far as your corporate income tax, which I think is an interesting concept, are you going to, I know the other body is looking at revision in the oil tax and tax credit, and then also in how to restructure basically the Hill Court tax. Are you going to be also doing your own research and how that integrates into your corporate income tax?
Yes. So because you know very well that because it's a tax bill, anything tax related can go into it at this point. And there is some demand from some members of the legislature to revisit the oil taxes in some form or fashion. And if we're talking about reducing a corporate income tax that benefits the larger oil companies, and some sort of political agreement requires us to address that, then I'm open to having those conversations. So again, I'm less worried about getting stuck on the details and more worried about getting a plan in place that stabilizes what we do down here in Juneau and stabilizes the predictability of finances for the state, which then helps with the economic engine for people coming into the state to want to invest, or even people who are in the state who want to invest, who just choose not to because they know that the state government's going to come after the corporations for taxes. So I'm more inclined to try to get a plan through than I am getting stuck on the details. So I'm willing to have those conversations.
Should I continue to follow up, or are there other questions?
If you have another question, go ahead.
So as far as your spending cap, those are Senator Kaufman's plans, right?
They
And,
are, Representative Stapp is carrying them in the House, but they are pretty much the same thing as Kaufman presented.
and we had Senator Kaufman present, and one of the interesting, I'm just wondering, and I know you just have so much capacity to study or to understand, but with his concepts, this is a novel one of using the GDP. And I didn't see anything really in his slide deck that broke down the GDP and exactly what it is. I mean, I know it because I look it up and understand, or somewhat understand it. And the devil's is in the details. Have you looked at the GDP and how those different levels actually work with it? I mean, you can kind of take the gross percentage, but our GDP isn't completely resource development. It's, in fact, that's part of it, but number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is not, it's more secondary economy. So I was just wondering if anybody's spending time on that.
Yeah, well, I would say that our economy is heavily influenced by government spending, and the proposal takes that government spending out of the equation because we don't want to incentivize government growth, growing the size of our government spending, new revenue coming in, new federal dollars, take the PFD and we're spending it through government and now we can spend more. That's a vicious cycle that we don't want to have. So tying the GDP, the equation of GDP specifically to your non-government economy is I think where he's at and where I'm at, that is what's important. We need to grow and incentivize growth in that area. And therefore the spending limit would rise and we would be allowed to spend more on government. But if part of the government, that part of the GDP that comes into the state now, which is government spending, is part of the equation, then we're creating a feedback loop that doesn't get us where we want to go.
And while I, in general, I think it's a great concept. I just hope that somebody also looks at the GDP, because just taking the government spending out does not really translate completely into the GDP, because your secondary, your engineering, your basically your support services are still highly affected by government funding, and it would still be very much a part of your GDP. So I'm not saying for or against. I just think folks need to think about it, or have a detailed look at it. That's my only suggestion, because it's in the front, it sounds really good, but I just want you to be somebody needs to be really, really familiar what the GDP is.
Okay. Well, if you've got some analysis that you would like me to read, then send it my way and I'll take a look at it.
Okay. Then the final one, the gas line, of course, for those of us who've been here forever, and it's an interesting thing, because it still isn't the cheapest gas, and you still have Qatar, for example, that just has so much gas and so much less expensive. So it will be, it will be great if it goes.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, everybody's got their opinion on whether it's going to happen or not, and until it does, we're all going to be guessing.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for presenting today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, again, for everybody online, you can submit questions in chat, and I'll take a swing at a couple here, Representative Carpenter. One is Alaska sort of has the dubious distinction based on some work with Pew Trusts that our tax base is the most volatile in the nation. And that volatility is largely based on our heavy reliance on one tax source. And so my question to you, has there been any consideration about how to smooth out the volatility of our oil and gas taxes? Is that a policy component that, much like in the way that we've anticipated smoothing out revenues from the permanent fund. Is there a mechanism that you could envision to try and smooth out natural resource revenue volatility so that we could have a more rational approach to our state spending?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The quick answer and the short answer is no. That's the smoothing out of oil revenue is not something that I have considered with my proposals for a long-term fiscal plan. This is before my time in the legislature, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the driving force for the whole conversation of ACEs a number of years ago was to help smooth that out. And to the extent that that took a lot of time and energy and political capital to get that through. And there's obviously varying opinions on whether it's the right thing for our state or not. If that subject were to be broached at this point in time and tried to be made part of this fiscal plan, I think it might scuttle the whole effort. And so I'm leery to entertain that conversation. I would like to shift the conversation to, if oil industry is a dying breed, if you will, worldwide, we've got downward pressure on oil industry, especially in Alaska. If you believe that that's going to continue, then we ought to just be focusing on growing an alternative and creating a fourth leg of the stool based on an additional source of economic engine within the state, whether that's going to be mining, whether that's agriculture, whether that's opportunities for remote working. Why can't the state of Alaska become the financial services state for the West Coast, right? Why can't we? Well, if we've got low cost energy coming in, we've got lots of space, a good position for families to come to. There's opportunity here, I guess is what I'm saying. And we don't have to continually focus on the oil industry as being the cash cow and how do we maximize our return from that. I just think that if we're focusing on that, we're missing opportunity in other areas. And to the extent that I want to focus on what needs to grow, that's where I want to focus.
Well, to that,
Juanetta?
yeah.
Hey,
Okay,
David Pease, I got a question if I could.
hang on just a second. Who's speaking?
David Pease.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, a couple times you mentioned low cost energy, and I guess the fundamental piece of that is apparently the in-state gas line. You indicated that that Goldman Sachs is rounding up investors. What I'm wondering is, what's the degree of certainty that is going on there in Juneau that this gas line will be constructed within the 5 to 7 year time frame? And if it's privately financed, what's the estimated delivered price of gas to the inlet?
Yeah, so degree of certainty, I'm not sure that is a very high number. I think we're all looking at the board of directors meeting, most recent board of directors meeting here was it last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago by now? Time flies. But looking at where they're at now, and I know that Frank Richards is down here in Juneau and having conversations with legislature currently, and he said, if your majority caucus wants to have a conversation with a representative from Goldman Sachs to understand better where they're at and what they need and what they're looking at, then we can do that. And I think we probably will. I don't want to speak for the speaker and the caucus, but it would make sense to me that we have that conversation. I don't know that I can answer the question on degree of certainty. If I had to, I would say, well, there's probably a very low degree of certainty that it's actually going to happen. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to. It just means that we aren't yet confident. And so I think there was another part to your question about the price to South Central Alaska. And I think that the goal, speaking with the governor, is down somewhere trying to get our electric price per kilowatt to around 10 cents a kilowatt. And that's the goal, right? That's why we need natural gas, is to drive down the cost of electricity. And that's where I know I think that's where he's at and where he would like to see it. And to the extent that we can get to that number, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Representative Carpenter. We have Stu Graham online with us, and he's asking, and I think you've addressed this, but maybe just for clarification purposes, your proposal, are you creating additional state bureaucracy for the collection of the sales tax, or is there some partnering with AML and municipalities to figure out another way to do that?
That's a good question. To the extent that my philosophical view on this, and I'll have to take a look at the bill and exactly what the structure is, I don't have a good answer to that. What I would want to do is reduce the amount of state bureaucracy that gets created and partner with local municipalities or businesses to collect that sales tax. I don't want to see growth in the size of state government to implement a sales tax. I mean, there's going to be some, right? Interestingly enough, and I think this might, we're going to have the conversation, but the PFD proposal that I've presented moves the permanent fund dividend program out of DOR and moves it into the permanent fund corporation. And there's a cost associated with doing that. But I think it would be a more secure place and a less political place for the program to be. And it would free DOR up with focusing on just revenue measures as opposed to paying dividends. I don't know whether that's going to survive the legislative process or not, but to the extent that that would simplify what DOR does, just dealing with revenue measures, maybe that's something that we can make work. I think it adds complexity to an already complex situation, and it likely won't survive this round. But anyway, philosophically, I don't want to see any more bureaucracy created than we absolutely have to.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Stu and Rep. Carpenter. I'm going to try and characterize something that is my understanding of the conundrum that we always have with producing new revenues. First of all, this really draws on actually a presentation by former representatives Ralph Samuels and Mike Hawker some years ago. But really the picture that they illustrated back then was that our oil and gas taxes, even then on the decline, were so huge in comparison to other revenue streams, and that Prudhoe Bay and Kupark and other oil fields were such whales. They were so huge and have had such long-term impact on our budgets that all of the other revenue generating proposals at that time, including income tax, sales tax, I'm trying to remember other revenue measures, could not come close to replicating or even putting a dent in the level of revenue possible with oil and gas taxes. And so to your point, you suggest that increasing economic vitality and taxing other economic activity would be part of the solution here. But is that, to use an analogy, is that a thumb in the leak in the dam, or is it really going to generate a significant level of revenue that will help us even out our revenue volatility?
Well, I guess I would answer this way. The lens that I'm looking through is not a lens to make sure that government survives at a level that we've had an expectation in the past. I'm looking at it through a lens that says the majority of people live and work in a non-oil private sector economy, which also means a non-government sector economy. Okay, that's where most people live and work. And when their kids graduate high school, they want to have a good job and they want their kids to stay local. So that's where I'm focusing. I want to see that economic engine and jobs grow in that sector of our economy. And I don't buy into the thinking that isn't possible. I think it's very possible for us to grow in ways that we may not even consider yet. What is very clear to me is that the policies of the past that are still part of our infrastructure, if you will, the government infrastructure, that were tied to the very high revenue possibilities from the oil industry. Not only are we kind of addicted or used to the money coming from oil, but the policies create a thinking process within the legislature that doesn't recognize or doesn't want to think about other possibilities. We just see the possibility of the money that's sitting before us, and we don't want to take risk or move away from that because it's way too easy to deal with it. So to the extent that we are now witnessing political pressure on even maintaining an oil industry, and we're seeing a downward turn in the price of oil that causes state revenue to decline, the conversation has to be refocus away from that one trick pony and grow the economic engine that isn't oil. It doesn't mean get rid of oil. It just means we need to grow and diversify our economy and tie our state government revenue streams to that economy so that the decision-making that happens within Juneau cares whether that portion of the economy grows or not. Because right now we don't. We say we do, especially around election time, but if you measure the bills, if you measure how much we care by the bills and resolutions that come across the floor about what we're going to do, what we actually are going to take action on, we aren't talking about the things that private sector economy would be caring about, which is low taxation, regulation reform, infrastructure development that has economic growth capacity, not just growing government, and low-cost energy, right? Those are things that we're kind of talking about, but we're not. There's no incentive for the government lobby, that the way that things are set up right now, there's no incentive to talk about low-cost energy because you can just go to the dividend. You can just go to the permanent fund earnings. You can just go to large oil, and we pay for expensive energy. And as long as that money source keeps coming, we're not going to be talking about actually being serious about alternate sources of energy. So I think we have to realize that in order to focus ourselves on a future growth that is not oil related, we have to restructure ourselves so that we actually care about that growth in a meaningful way, meaning it impacts our budget or impacts our policy decisions somehow.
So just to follow on with that, creating that economic vitality in this new economic activity, more diversified economy, will require a significant level of taxation. So what is the pitch, if you will, to new actors to come to Alaska, or for Alaskans to risk their risk investment to create that new economy without knowing what that tax environment looks like, or that it could be a very high level of taxation in order to replace or even out those other revenue streams?
I guess I'm not in agreement that is the case. We need to balance the budget, and then private sector comes in and invests in opportunities, and the government needs to get out of the way and allow them to do that. I'm not looking for a government solution to all of our problems. And I don't think that's in our best interest. I'm not looking at replacing all of the oil revenue. I don't think that's realistic or something that would be healthy for the state. I'm just recognizing that of the three sources of revenue that we have right now, they're all within this next decade going to be in decline. That's my prediction. And my crystal ball is as cloudy as your crystal balls, right? I don't know for sure, but all the evidence indicates that those three sources of revenue are challenged. And if we don't have an additional source of revenue based on economic activity that's not created by government, I'm not saying, and this is part of the challenge, is that there's thinking that says, hey, if we're ever going to have anything happen in the state, we got to put state or federal money towards it to make it happen. I don't agree. I think the government gets out of the way and allows industry, people with money who see opportunity and want to capitalize on it, to come and prosper. So I don't buy into, and I don't agree that we need to have additional higher taxation in order to generate economic activity. This sales tax and the corporate income tax reduction work together to generate revenue necessary to sustain the budget as it is, and our sales spending cap bills act as a leveling effect on the binges that we have within the spending when we have times of high oil price. So if we don't ever have high oil prices or spikes in revenue, then the spending cap's not going to do anything for us, really. It doesn't force us to save money from a year where we have a lot to spend it on a year when we don't have a lot. So but that's what the effect is supposed to do, to the extent that we may from time to time have spikes in oil revenue. And that's likely to happen if I'm looking at long-term oil prices. You're periodically going to have, spikes that have a windfall for us, and the tendency, like it was last year, to just spend all the money. Just spend it. That's what we want to do up here or down here in Juneau.
Okay.
So I don't know whether that answers your question or helps with where my headspace is at, but
yeah, I've spent the last couple of days, at least partially, at the Arctic Encounter, and there's lots of conversations going on around this, and also around the future of oil and gas globally. And that we're sort of in this interesting inflection point in time where there's a great deal of pressure. A lot of times when any of the conversations about reduced oil and gas, reduced greenhouse emissions, those things garnered applause amongst the audience. But the reality also of needing oil and gas, needing mining, needing those things in order to get to this re-envisioned decarbonized clean energy economy. And so it just seems like there's some missing policy pieces, both from an economic, state government taxation policy, all of those things that we have yet to sort of hit on the sweet spot. But in terms of the other sectors and what they're able to do, they at least here in Alaska in the last 40 years have operated in the very beneficial spot of having another industry pay for services from which they benefit. And so if that changes in terms of either level of production or level of taxation, I think we do have to consider what the impacts are and what the viability of that shadow economy without oil and gas might look like.
So maybe one thing that needs some clarification here, just to understand where I'm at. I'm coming from a planning perspective that says we need to plan on oil revenue in decline because of all of the political pressures that are aligned. It makes it risky to assume that we're going to have growth in the oil industry.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that oil industry is going away anytime soon? Personally, no, I don't. I think there are too many products and too many things that we deal with on a daily basis that we expect as consumers that are tied directly to the petrochemical industry, that it is not going away anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a downward pressure, and we shouldn't expect that the large amounts of revenue that have come in the past is something that we can rely on. So from a planning perspective, I don't want to put my eggs into a basket that says we want to rely on this thing, but we aren't sure that it's ever going to be able to produce like it has in the past. So I want to put my eggs in a basket that I want to be able to influence to grow. Well, I can't influence oil and gas to grow. That's a worldwide problem right now. I don't even have control over whether the new projects get permitted in Alaska, for goodness sakes. So we got to look at non-oil revenue, non-oil economic engine to see how that's going to, where we can grow in the state.
Well, thank you. I'm bringing Cheryl back in for any final
Okay.
questions and any sign off. Cheryl?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Juanetta. And thank you, Representative Carpenter. We really appreciate your insights. And I empathize with your challenge of, a fiscal gap is created by two lines. You're just dealing with the revenue line, but you've also talked about the spending line. And I hope that the finance committees are looking at, what's the value for dollars being spent? Because too often it's just the measure is, did we spend more? And that shows that we care more. And so it's the effectiveness of the dollars being spent that is critically important too. So I'll get off that soapbox. That's another one I have about value for dollars spent. So with that, again, we'll send you the report we did last year about what Alaskans had to say about the choices. We have a revenue section and a spending section. And we'd welcome, how can we help? Once session's over with, you've sifted through the embers, and if there's a way in which we can help advance the discussions of what needs to be still resolved. Maybe you're going to solve everything. That would be great. But if not, we stand ready to help, and really appreciate the work that you're putting into and the thought that you're putting into the choices and the trade-offs. And it's not just about government, it is also about the private sector. So thank you. So with that,
you're welcome. And I would just like to say here at the tail end of the conversation that the proposals that I have forward now to meet the Fiscal Policy Working Group as best we can, the recommendations, I have many other projects that I'm working on. And one of them is, how do we get the legislative process, the budgeting process down here to actually talk about prioritizing spending? Because we don't do that.
right,
We don't really do that. And
Right.
to the extent that we want to see a leaner, more efficient government, we need to have that good management discussion about priorities. And so I think we either need to turn the legislature and executives' attention to our Executive Budget Act that lays out how we're supposed to communicate about spending, or revise that document to the extent that it needs to be revised to encourage us or force us to have a better conversation, a better management conversation.
good. Well, we'd be glad to have input there too. So good. Looking forward to the results from this session, as well as how we can work with you going forward. So again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the
appreciate it.
opportunity. It was a good conversation. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Thank you. So, okay, folks, well, we'll reconvene later again, and stay tuned for information about our project going forward for our summer project. So Juanetta, thank you. Do you have any final announcements?
Nope. By Representative Carpenter from the peninsula.
Is that Lisa?
Yep,
Hey, Lisa, good to hear your voice.
yep, it's we're waiting for the session to end so the snow can melt.
It needs to be melted before I get back.
Yeah, possibly. All right, thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
Bye.
Juanetta, you're on mute.
Sorry, thanks to everybody for joining us. I think Lisa has established a new omen for this first sign of spring, is the legislature has to adjourn first. So the pressure is on Representative Carpenter.
We're the
And
new groundhog, is it?
yeah. Well, you know how much Alaskans want to see something that resembles spring. So hopefully that's around the corner. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Have a great weekend. We don't have any sessions scheduled on the calendar at this point. As things heat up and you guys are moving forward in Juneau with the legislative session, folks' time is very precious. So we'll hopefully reconvene, as Cheryl said, around some work this summer to do some work, hopefully in support of the direction that the legislature's headed. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rep. Carpenter. Bye.